So here it is, the $1,000,000 question. Should we pay musicians who serve in the church? Now, if you spend any time in worship leading forums, you've no doubt seen this question posted, debated, argued, and had the comments shut down time and time again. There are those who are completely for it and those who are completely against it. But ultimately what matters is not our opinion, but what the biblical model for church musicians states. So here it is, the final answer. Musicians who served in the temple were compensated full-time servants who had no other entanglements. They were all fully supported for their fulfillment of the musical worship leadership in the temple. They were paid. And I think we should do the same thing, but let's look at it further. I can already hear some of you pushing back on that. They're saying that was the Old Testament, not the modern church. They were born into it from the tribe of Levi. That was the Jewish worship of the temple and not the modern church in the New Testament. Okay, so yeah, those things are true, but that doesn't mean that the biblical principles don't apply. There's a considerable amount of text in Numbers and Chronicles about these musicians. It's clear what was expected of them, what they did, and how they were cared for. So let's take a look at what the Bible has to say. In researching this, I found a great academic article from a guy named Greg Strawbridge who was exploring this. And here's his quick summary of his findings. It says, summing up, the music ministry at the temple was conducted by experienced and mature Levites who were trained musically, prepared spiritually, supported financially, and served pastorally. There are some other instances of song throughout Scripture for sure, but the model of David leading in the temple is the best section to study when it comes to organized corporate gatherings in an established house of worship. Now, there's three key things we're going to look at in studying this passage a bit. We're going to look at the organization of the musicians. Second, we're going to look at the expectations placed on the musicians, and then the compensation of the musicians. So first, let's look at the organization. We find in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, David organizes a musician 3 different times based on the context of their ministry. First, when they travel and they're mobile. Second, when they're in a tent in Jerusalem in a temporary location. And third, when they're in the permanent temple setting. Now, that probably sounds familiar to those of us who have planted a church in a mobile setting and not really had a home and then moved into a temporary rented space and then started in a permanent building. And each time, those phases had different requirements and provided different opportunities for how the musicians led others in worship. And that's the same for the Old Testament and for us now in the modern context. So first, we see David organizing when the ark was traveling to its place in the tent in Jerusalem. The musicians were appointed by the heads of the Levite families. David put out a call to those on the ground in the trenches and said, organize the musicians amongst you. Let's put together those who are going to lead us as we travel. There wasn't a ton of oversight. There wasn't a ton of organization to it. It was just gather the musicians amongst you who are doing the work right now and use them to lead the people as they travel. So the second organization we see is when they get to their temporary home, and there's 2 choirs formed by David to sing where the burnt offerings are laid upon the altar. And these 2 choirs were placed under the leadership and authority of Asaph in Jerusalem and Herman and Jeduthun, later called Ethan, in Gibeon. We see this in 2 Chronicles 8 and 1 Chronicles 16. And the third phase of this organization is in Solomon's temple. The music and the worship was considerably more elaborate and thus required further organization and had more requirements for the musicians. 1 Chronicles 15:16 and 23:5, David established a group of 4,000 Levites from amongst the 38,000 Levites at the temple. So only 4,000 of the 38,000 were chosen. The other Levites were guards of the temple and had other duties, but just over 10% of the total Levites were called from all of the nations, the nation of Israel, to lead the entire nation in worship. And so this selection of 10% implies that there was some sort of standards or skills and spiritual test or evaluation that proved their qualifications, which sounds a lot like modern auditions for a worship team, if you ask me, that there was some sort of measuring of skill and ability to choose those who were best qualified and equipped and called to serve as worship leaders. In 1 Chronicles 25:6, Asaph, Jeduthun, and Haman were under the supervision of the king, under King David, and along with their relatives, all of them who were trained and skilled in music for the Lord, number 288. So we see from even amongst those small parts of the tribe and that leadership, there's only 288 that were counted as skilled and trained musicians. They were trained and skilled. That's important. They weren't just whoever walked up and could kind of do it. Once they moved into the temple, they had a high standard of excellence, and a small percentage of people met the expectation from out of those 38,000 people who were in leadership. So later we see David appointed 24 leaders who each had 12 musicians and were then in charge of selecting other musicians as necessary. So he goes from anybody can serve down to 2 leaders, then to spreading out to 24 leaders to meet all the needs of the people and all the services they were doing, and placed and entrusted the leadership of those musicians into 24 leaders' hands. And these leaders facilitated and organized and executed the music in the temple. They were essentially in charge of selecting music and musicians and upholding standards of excellence, which probably sounds very familiar and similar to the job of the modern worship pastor and music director, who are entrusted with the same thing. Now, here's one key piece of this leadership as it transitioned. The last and probably most important note in this organization is that these musicians were led under the authority of the king and the priestly temple leaders. 1 Chronicles 23:28 places these musicians under the authority of the priests that are leading the entire group of worshipers in sacrifice. So they had accountability and had to submit to leadership. Musicians don't always like this, but it's necessary, and it was necessary in the Old Testament, and it's necessary now that we submit to our leaders who are in charge of the entire congregation so we can effectively serve within our context. Now, in the modern context, this development sounds very familiar. When you're mobile, you're not a large gathering, and your pool of available talent and skills is limited, so you do what you can with those you have. And at some point, things have to get a bit more organized. So the increased requirements of number of services and expectations of excellence and available technology and congregation size needs to have a little bit more organization to accomplish and meet the structure of the church. Right? And so finally, there comes a time where you have to consider excellence or skill and spiritual requirements when adding to your numbers to ensure that you're all on the same page and you're going after the same mission. Now, this is not to say that excellence doesn't matter from day one. That's an entirely separate video and topic to talk about. This is simply to say that as the Old Testament congregation grew and became more permanent, their requirements necessitated increased organization and increased standards to be applied. And the same is true for us. The organization of your team must meet the needs of your congregation, its context, its size, and its location. Here's the second thing. The expectations placed on the musicians of biblical times. Now, there's some clear basic expectations that all biblical temple musicians had to meet. First, they all came from the tribe of Levi. Now, I'm not sure there's a direct connection between this and modern worship leaders, but I will say that the way we could take this is a clear requirement for community, partnership, and support of one another, which it's not always present. It's really easier to compare talents and abilities and grow through endless scrolling online that actually develops a community of musicians who are disjunct and separated and comparing to each other, rather than a community of musicians that are committed to grow together and to care for one another. And families are messy, so are musicians. It's not easy, but we should be building communities that build a legacy of developing the next generation of church musicians constantly. And second, in the requirements, they were trained and skilled. I already mentioned this, but rabbinical sources state that their intense professional training took no less than 5 years of preparation. And since we also know that they began serving at the age of 30 from 1 Chronicles 23, 3 through 5, they essentially studied as young as adults, as college-age musicians, to become professional church musicians in the temple. Now, this isn't to say they went to college and got a degree, and that's not the requirement, but they were mentored, they were trained, and they were taught and tested on all they needed to know prior to being placed in the service of leading others in God. And finally, the most important thing in the requirements is that they were spiritually mature. They were trained in their faith, the leadership of their faith, and the knowledge of God, and not just music. They were called to sanctify themselves and to make themselves holy. They met all the requirements of Levitical leadership and were focused on putting God first throughout the entirety of their life at all times. So how does this apply to our teams? Well, let's ask ourselves a couple critical questions. First, are our musicians a core part of our church community? Second, are they musically trained and skilled? And third, Are they mature in faith and putting God first in all things? Now, if you answer no to any of those questions, I'm not sure this final part about compensation is really where you're at yet. You need to consider how you get them meeting requirements and get an organizational structure that sets up success for your teams. But if you answered yes, then we should talk about how the musicians were compensated for their commitment. So here we are, compensation of musicians. It's important to understand that these Levitical musicians were full-time workers for the church. 1 Chronicles 9:33, it says, those who were musicians, heads of Levite families, stayed in the rooms of the temple and were exempt from other duties because they were responsible for the work day and night. The Levite musicians were set apart and free from other services within even the temple and were available at all times to lead others in worship. They were freed up not for luxury or to sit in a green room and eat snacks, but rather so they had the time for the intense spiritual and musical preparation and commitment their calling demanded. Because of this, they were compensated from the tithe offered to the priesthood. Strawbridge says this, he says, an indication of the importance of the music ministry can be seen in the fact that Levite musicians were paid out of the same tithes given for the support of the priesthood. You can find that in Numbers 18:24-26 and Nehemiah 10, 12, and 13. Now, from their payment, they were also required to tithe. They weren't just given money to go off and run and buy shiny new gear and snappy new outfits. No, they tithed from what they received. This was called the tithe of tithes. You find this in Numbers 18:26 and verse 29. Verse 26 says, moreover, you shall speak and say to the Levites, when you take from the people of Israel the tithe that I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present a contribution from it to the Lord, a tithe of tithes. Verse 29 says, out of all the gifts to you, you shall present every contribution due to the Lord. From each, its best part is to be dedicated. So yes, musicians in biblical times were paid to lead others in worship, providing that they met the spiritual, musical, and Levitical requirements for leadership. They were organized and had a clear church authority and oversight. They were also expected to fully commit to the membership of their community, and they tithed from what they received. So what does the organization, expectation, and compensation of the Old Testament worship leaders mean for the modern context? Well, modern pastors are not Levites, unless they happen to be from the lineage of the tribe of Levi. But even then, their duties are quite different. However, when reading through the detailed requirements and expectations for temple musicians in the Old Testament, we can draw some important insights into how we should approach modern worship leadership. These include the importance of skill, spiritual maturity, oversight, organization, and yes, even compensation. We should evaluate our own ministry and seek to mirror these principles in a responsible manner that meets the stewardship requirements and abilities of our faith communities. I believe, and the Bible states, that a worker is worth their wages. The musicians that serve in the Old Testament and now have dedicated a considerable amount of time into their craft and hopefully to their spiritual development as well. So provided that our modern musicians are pursuing spiritual and musical excellence, they are worth their wages as well. Ultimately, you and your leadership have to make and answer this question for your context and convictions. And I hope that looking at this scripture might move you a little bit closer to realizing that biblical compensation for musicians should be mirrored in the modern church and those who are serving in the house of the Lord. So whether that answers the question for you or not, I don't know, but my convictions based on scripture is that we should be paying our musicians because they're dedicating their life, they're dedicating their time, and they should be invested in the same way that they're investing themselves and in our communities. Hey, thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching. I hope you give it a like and a subscription. I'll be posting more videos like this to help out worship leaders, music directors, and church leadership as they pursue excellence with their team.